Well, that's, and I was wondering the distinction between persnickety and fastidiousness.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I haven't thought about that, but you make a good point. Yeah.
Well,
I just like how persnickety rolls off my tongue.
neither one of them roll off my tongue very well.
Okay.
Let me put my ears in.
Okay.
You're really foggy today, Ed.
Maybe, let's see. Are we there? Am I on?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Maybe we should start and then, yeah, Ed, how the hell are you? Are you there, Ed? Are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here.
We're having a discussion, and maybe you can do it. The distinction between persnickety and fastidiousness.
Persnickety is much more intense.
Is it?
Thank you. Thank you.
So on a spectrum, on a continuum, persnickety
is further down the line than fastidiousness.
Because I consider myself fastidious.
Yes, and I think that's fine. And if you take that to an extreme, you become persnickety.
So that's the extreme.
That's how I see it. But that's just how I see it.
Well, I think you're well informed on many things regarding language. So,
when do you just become a pain in the ass?
Huh? Excuse me?
When does one just become a pain in the ass?
Where is that on the spectrum?
Yeah, it depends on who you are. Yeah. It depends on who you are.
Oh
you
my God, he's got his.
It's a good utilitarian reason for this today. My eyes are extremely bloodshot, but not for the reason you would suspect.
No, not for the reason we would hope.
I've got a massive head cold. It struck me over the weekend. And so I've spent the last couple of days just stuffing my face with tissues. And
wow.
That's a bummer.
Yeah, it's okay. I think it's just clearing out the system a little bit.
So here we go. Here we go, Marco. I had to. That's probably. You wouldn't let me drive you home. You walked home in that frigging blizzard. A week or two ago. Whenever.
Is this an archetypal conversation? Are we?
Yeah.
No, it was my daughters. They're the ones they were the vectors. They brought the pathogens into the house, and I have been.
That.
That's what you think.
No, that's what I believe. I believe that. I have a little one here at home, and whatever's on the big sign in kindergarten, I know what to make myself ready for because it's just coming home. That's all there is to it.
Yeah, right.
I mean, my own behavior and my own constitution also has made me vulnerable to it as well, I would say. I mean, so I'm not blaming them. I'm not ascribing causality. I think that my system also, because of the stresses on it, et cetera, I kind of made myself susceptible because I was outrunning it for about a week or two. I felt it, I felt it coming, and I knew it was in the air, but I was taking better care of myself, and the last week or so, I overworked. I kind of overheated, and I think that allowed it to take over.
Were you reading my book? It has that effect on people.
No, but it is second on my list. I'm going to finish the book that I'm reading currently, and then I'm going to read yours. And they're going to be a nice juxtaposition, I think, two different views of America. And maybe I'll write about that, actually. I won't tell you what I'm reading right now, I've actually talked about it earlier, but I think getting those two views, your view and another view that's totally, it's not related to the election necessarily, but I think it is part of the same discourse. That may give me some perspective to share later.
Well, to tie this into the topic, because I just rewatched the Wilbur on Peterson and Jeremy Johnson's thing, that Doug linked. I just watched them back to back. I find them fascinating. And to say that all of it is linked together, which I think Wilbur and Gebser does they try, and that's the whole integral thing, right?
Yeah, very much. I'd say it's a kind of multidimensional causality, multidimensional account of causality. So it's not saying that the cause of something is purely external, nor that it's purely internal, nor that it's purely individual, nor that it's purely social or collective, but it's a kind of it's an effect of all of those, a meshing of all of those. Wilbur has a term that he that relates to his four quadrants. He calls it tetra arising, and the idea being that those different dimensions, interior, exterior, technology, consciousness, however you divide it up, really they're really not divided in reality. They arise together, and so they're always mutually influencing and affecting each other. So it's very that is one part of the integral idea, and I think that Loeffler is doing that in effect. And it's not, you don't need the four quadrants to do that. You could just do it organically or intuitively. And I think he's doing that when he describes the relationship between how machines evolve and how our thinking and our consciousness evolves. But that gets into the conversation. I'm not sure if we want to go there yet.
So I didn't really have a frame as usual. I framed this one as the onset of Outsight, whatever that means. I think TJ coined the term Outsight by accident in his forum post. So he mentioned Outsight as the ability to do this projection into the future. So I like the term. I happen to be reading Farsighted by Stephen Johnson, one of those bestsellers with a nice marketing color and a nice little icon on the cover to kind of attract your attention to it. But the title attracted me, and similar to, I guess Marco said he's sick, and I know in the past he's mentioned this sickness is a time to reflect. It's a time to, well, you're kind of stuck in the doldrums, but you have those chances to reflect. Well, it wasn't really my daughter's fault. It was because I overworked myself, or I'm working towards something else and neglected the body, something like that. So that's a form of foresight or farsightedness or outsight. So where do we go with this? To frame it, if I could try to frame farsightedness into the conversation. Stephen Johnson in the book mentions that we have these tools in front of us now that we didn't at one point. And he doesn't give specifics, but he gives out kind of a map of his own. He's saying we can map, we can predict, and then we make decisions based on that. The mapping covers the full spectrum of the situation, and as we project into the future or consider the long term, then we're able to create better maps. And then that brings us into running scenarios, running simulations, whether virtually in our mind or with virtual tools that many sciences use nowadays. So that helps us to make better predictions, to make better decisions, perhaps. But the onset, I don't know why I use the term onset. I don't know if I know the full definition of what onset means. We were throwing out a lot of big words at the beginning. A little word like onset, when I looked it up in the dictionary after I had placed it there, it has a more negative tone. So onsets of outsight is actually perhaps a misterm there, because I'm looking for the positive in this, but an onset of outsight means perhaps that we have to, I think we can all agree here, we're stuck in a cloud of the unknown. We don't know what the future will hold. We don't know what person to elect president to make the right decisions for us. So I think what Stephen Johnson is asking us to do is reflect on ourselves. So when we do that, we focus on ourselves. What can we do? But at the same time, we have this overarching, pressing environmental concern. That seems to be a universal theme all around, whether you're on this side, the left side, and you're reflecting on what we can do with the new Green Deal or something like that. Or if you're on the opposite end of, well, yeah, I can agree that it seems like we're in the anthropic climate here, and what we do affects the environment. Whether it needs policy or something like that is a different story. So the environmental concerns kind of cloud our current decisions, or at least most of us here. I think we can all agree that we have that concern for the environment. So it goes branching out from there. We're in a perpetual loop. So for this conversation, perhaps we can consider such things as mapping. Do we want to map out this conversation? Probably not. That takes up a lot of time. We have a 2-hour frame and we've already utilized 1/10 of it. So what do we do with the rest of the time we have available? What do we see as the end product? Where do we want to go with it? So John, we haven't heard your audio yet. If you want to do an audio check, you don't necessarily have to start us out.
7 years ago. Can you hear me?
Sounds good. Would you like to start us out, Mark? Beyond
Would I?
the initial,
Well, okay.
Or continue where we had a direction, and
as I said last time, I never mute myself, much to my.
And I never clarified. I muted you because there was a high-pitched whining noise that appeared after you stood up, so I muted you.
Okay. Well,
there you go. But I'll mute myself now.
Yeah, like I said, I just watched the Jeremy Johnson podcast, and then I followed it up with my second watching of the Wilbur speaking on fairly recently, I guess. So I thought that was really interesting to contrast I guess everybody agrees sort of that Gebser first came up with the integral thing, but Wilbur popularized it, brought it into the mainstream, at least here in America. And the contrast, and their ages are quite different. Wilbur is right there with Ed and I. We were born in the same year, so we experienced the world very similarly. And then Jeremy is, I don't know, probably two generations removed from us. So a lot of what Wilbur was talking about, I think Jeremy's a product of that green, you know, if you're born Generation Z, and the educational system has indoctrinated is a strong word, but teaches one thing. You think you're coming in at, if we use Wilbur's terminology, green sort of level, but Wilbur's saying everybody starts at ground zero. And then if I would tie Gebser into it, he almost, it sounds to me, and I read your paper, Ed, I thought that was great. And I'm getting this sense that he really didn't think there was a continuation of evolution. One thing leads to another, and like you were complaining about, Ed, gaps. So that there is just all of a sudden some level of consciousness appears, and it didn't really evolve, but it's part of what came before. But then there was this, just like, now everybody thinks this, you know, everybody has this level of consciousness. So I found the contrast between Jeremy Johnson's thinking and, you know, and Wilbur's, I found that fascinating. And agreeing with some, but of course not all, of both points of, you know, worldviews, whatever. So there you go.
That could go in a number of directions, and I'm loath to comment because I know both Jeremy and Ken Wilber personally, and so that's going to color my interpretation. I haven't actually listened to the exact podcasts or watched the videos you're referring to, but I could probably fill in the gaps if we were to flesh out really what the focus is. I think there is a connection to be made between Gebser, Wilbur, the idea of integral, Loeffler, and also farsightedness. And I was glad that, Doug, that you brought that book up, because I've been reading it too, and I have it over here. And it's funny that it's funny that you brought it up, because this actually came, like, I heard it was a podcast with Johnson, and he was talking about how groups of people make far-sighted decisions, wise. And he didn't use this language. I mean, that's what's. But I would say wise decisions. He gave an example of a park in New York City that in the 1800s was a pond or something like that, and they didn't know what to do with it. So various developers were consulted, and they tried to make plans, and they ended up, rather than turning it into a park, they paved it over and built houses on it. And a couple of decades later, because they didn't know enough about geology and, you know, the way to engineer things like that, the houses started sinking. This was like 5 points, five direction. I don't know I'd have to go back to the book for the details, but the question he's asking is, like, how do we make far-sighted, intelligent decisions? Like, how can we know what to do when we don't have all the variables, when we don't have all the knowledge, when there's there's information that is outside of not only what we know, but what we even can know. And I think this is part of Loeffler's project as well, and this is part of his idea of the anterior future, is that the future it's anterior, because it's prior to it's shaped. It's not shaped linearly. It's shaped through a kind of recursive movement where the anticipation that we have of it becomes influences how we act in the present, which changes the future. So our anticipation of it is part of its formative process. And then that anticipation, that capacity to, I would say, virtualize possible futures and then act on or not act on them depending on the results of our kind of scenarios. Like that's what that's what humans have gained the capacity to do in prehistory, so-called prehistory. But what we now are doing in very vast scales, using machine learning and AI and so forth, and these, we're operating on a planetary level now, but we don't all know it, and we don't all know like what objectively is happening there. So I see the connection because each of these thinkers is telling a story about how consciousness appears and like what is happening in the world right now, what is happening in our reality, in our existence right now, and what is that they're each trying to anticipate the future. That's Gebser's integral. It's also Wilber's integral. There's a very complex history with all those thinkers. I wouldn't say that Gebser invented integral. There's a number of other thinkers who used the word or who were thinking in similar ways. This is another thing that Loeffler remarks upon, is the way that emergences happen simultaneously, kind of in parallel in a distributed way. So there's like calculus, the way Leibniz and Newton invented calculus at the same time, but without knowledge of each other. So there's something bigger happening than just the local perspective, and that's what I think what I think that Loeffler is attempting to bring into the discourse is how to kind of think simultaneously at multiple levels. That's a first stab anyway at making some sense of this.
I'll slightly build on that, at least the connection I made between Stephen Johnson with the farsightedness and his mapping, predicting, and making decisions or deciding. Those three, if I was to align it with somebody else who does aligning, is Jennifer Gidley. And she focuses on the individuals that she's, who examine consciousness, the giants, Steiner, Gebser, Aurobindo, Wilber. And she identifies certain ones, Wilber as the map maker. So I see that as Johnson? Yeah, his mapping. And then we have the territory with Steiner. That's kind of the predictive phase. That's the virtual, whether mental, whatever it might be, projections. And then we're always looking for guides, and quite a few of us are guided by Gebser. I forget where I don't know if she terms Aurobindo anything. Maybe he's all three to a certain extent, or more of a map and territory fella, but he's also a guide. So I'm imagining Loeffler, he's recognized a lot of maps and has his own. That's perhaps the theory part too. He's focused on future territory, so he doesn't have he has some tangible evidence, I suppose. Maybe we can explore that. But at the same time, he doesn't want to be a guide, but I would imagine his theory and the predictions he's making can allow for us as a collective to be our own guides to a certain extent with what we have in front of us, whatever that means.
I'll just chime in quickly because I mean there are a lot of things that we can put on the table that are fairly obvious. You know, it doesn't have to be so abstract. Like we know that there's 7.5 million going to 10, billion going to 10 billion people on the planet. We know about changing temperatures. We know about rising seas. We know about the technologies that are being developed, like AI and machine learning, and the way that these are being operationalized on a planetary scale, really, to kind of envelop the whole. We know all of these trends that are unfolding, and to me, I think the urgent question is one is getting perspective, like having an objective view of what's happening. But then two, once you have a view that seems somewhat reliable, what do you do about it? Because there are different possibilities. There's scenarios will not just play out kind of in a deterministic fashion, but they'll be influenced by our own actions now. So how we envision the future is influences how the future unfolds. And that's what I think is Loeffler's, to me, that's the thing that this stream that I'm interested in. But the details I think are important as well. And so I appreciate the discussion that has been going on in the forum on the thread relating to last week's talk, because between Ed and John and TJ and Mark, you were in and I think we're actually reading it in a creative way, and it's a messy, but it's a kind of generative reading we might be doing. So, let's continue doing that, I guess, is what I want to say.
Can I add something just real quick on top of that? When I was tutoring strategy, the first thing that we tried to accomplish in the course was to get clear on the distinction between what's tactical and what's strategic. And in the business environment, we'll just take the narrow case of the business world, the corporate world, or whatever it is. Strategy, as opposed to tactics, turns out to be long term. But what does long term mean? It's really important, I believe, and this was something that my experience bears out because of what I went through in the course that I was tutoring, is what's long term. In the 50s, banks thought in terms of 50-year cycles. Well, nobody that I know of in the corporate world thinks in 50-year cycles anymore. Most corporations think in terms of quarters. And if you're in the internet or the IT business or in any of those related fields, there was that meme that kind of went around that, internet years are like dog years, so it's like one calendar year is like 7 internet years or whatever it is. And it's really, I think it's important for all of us when we're thinking about these things to get a handle on, well, what do we mean by the future? How future is the future? What are we actually talking about in those terms? And this is one of the things I really appreciate about what Loeffler said and what was in the interview as well, because he says, if we don't get our act together, John pointed out 6 degrees, it's over in 2030. We're in 2019. So it's like, okay, well, that's one possibility. The other possibility is we get our shit together and maybe we know that oil's going to run out in 2050. So there's another like threshold out there that we could talk about. But we have to decide what is it that we're actually talking about. And I appreciated that part of what Loeffler said more than about anything else that he did say, because we can think about going to Mars, but we may never get off the launch pad. That's another possibility. So when we talk about the future, what future in a purely time sense are we talking about?
Well, that's a very deep question, Ed, and you've all been sort of overwhelming me with all kinds of different ways trying to get a handle on this material. I'm just, in what kind of future? That's a big question. I'm just reminded that there were some who predicted when typewriters were invented that it would put pencils and pens out of business. Now, of course, pencils and pens are all over the place, but no one sees a typewriter. So what kind of future are we talking about? And I will admit, I have to take responsibility for this. When you start talking about machine learning, Marco, when you talk about machines evolving, I get triggered. That creates a negative affect. I feel it in my solar plexus. It throbs. And I feel a desire to take my fists and smash something against the wall, maybe. Start having a temper tantrum. So, having said all of that, what would I like to have happen? Well, I would love for you to take off your glasses, but if there's a medical reason why you have them on, that's great, because that also gives me a kind of heebie-jeebies looking at somebody's sunglasses, because the eyes, you know, are the window to the soul. So I have to adapt to that.
There is a medical reason, actually.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I hope you recover very, very quickly, because I'd love to see your soul. I want to see your eyes again. Because that's how I read affectively what's going on with another person. And so do all of you. This is hardwired in us. Of course, blind people can have an extrasensory perception. They can't see, but they can hear voices and make very subtle discriminations through the voice that perhaps we cannot, because we don't have that particular set of constraints. But I'm just wanting to bring all this together in some way. And I think this is a big chunk for me. But I think what Loeffler is, one of the themes he's picking up on is moving from first order systems theory to a second order. First order is a view from the outside. I'm the observer viewing you over there. You are the system. I put a circle around you, and I study that system over there. Second order, it shifts to something that is observer participant. I am no longer an outside observer. I am now a participant observer. And this is basically all he means when he's saying second order culture. Now we're in a field of many possibilities, and it's a two-way communique, or a three-way or a four-way communique. It's not just coming from top to bottom. So that's one thing I think he points to. And I think he's looking at the transformations in history, technological transformations. I think it's really fascinating when we start thinking about this. Because like the Greeks, they were using money. They had simple machines. They did not have workers. They had slaves. They did make profits, but those profits were saved. They did not invest their profits into capital investments. That corresponded to something that happened later when we have these compound machines. Machines are no longer simple but complicated, and you're having workers move in very repetitive ways this machine, like this. That's what the worker did all day long. And the profits, which were often skimmed off of that labor, went into capital investments. So, which was creating a great deal of competition among many different players. Now, I think this is where he's looking at as what we're in now is a view. I think you've said this too, Marco, in some of your writing. We're looking at I mean, Plato was looking at the view from nowhere, really, whereas we are looking at the view from everyone or everybody. And this, I believe, is a very big shift. Like that second order, perhaps even third order kind of systems thinking. And so I think that's where we're at now. And I think it's understandably appears to us to be very chaotic. But I think he's also pointing out that it's not just about multiculturalism, that, and how do we integrate differences? How do we, because I think of a culture with 50 members is very, very different from a culture with 50 million members. There's just going to be more complexity and more diversity in a culture with 50 million persons engaged. And I think that he's coming out of a lot of post-structuralism and postmodernism, and this sort of all cultures are created equal kind of ethos. And I believe he's challenging, he finds a lot of that doesn't work. And I'm just wanting to say, I don't want to get too far out of my, this is once again, very, very difficult for me to talk about this stuff because I'm drawing on many different models and not just Loeffler's. But I think Loeffler has a lot in common with a lot of other thinkers, which has been mentioned already. But I also want to bring in this idea of final causes from Aristotle. And I believe, and I think Deva would agree with this, that there has been in the postmodern a rejection of final causes, what they call teleology or purpose. And if you look back at Aristotle, we're talking about 4 different kinds of causes. There's a material cause, an efficient cause, a formal cause, and a final cause. Very simply, to build a house, you need wood and you need metal. That's an efficient cause. You need carpenters and workers. That's efficient. You need a blueprint. That's for a formal cause. The final cause is living in the house. And that's the purpose for all of these different causes, the interplay of all of these different causes. And I believe this is something that I think that has to be with Darwinism and neo-Darwinism and a lot of the AI, which comes out of first order kind of thinking, which is definitely outside, observing the system over there, and how can the observer manipulate that system for the benefit, presumably, of the one who's doing the observing, to something that's second order. I think that's we have to start thinking about, I think, those final causes again, and taking them seriously. What do you want to have happen is an invitation to start working with final causes. And I believe that has been so important to, I believe, most of the social movements that have created transformative change has been maybe a handful of people who knew what they wanted. Of course, we could also make the case that there were a handful of people who knew what they wanted, who were very nefarious actors. And they were thinking in terms of a first order kind of system. And they're trying to manipulate that. And I think those kinds of characters are still very much on the scene today. So that's why I'm sort of triggered by the idea of machine learning. Machine learning according to whom? And one more thing I want to say, and this is something I'm also working out with the idea of boundary. Every boundary has an inside and an outside. So when we're looking at the cellular level, it's not about the genes communicating or dictating to the cell. It's about the membrane, around the cell. And there's always an inside and an outside. It's bilayered. There's certain components that are friendly to water and certain components that are hostile to water. And they create a bond. And this is what allows for the inside and the outside of the cell. And then there are all kinds of interpretive maneuvers. And does it have a size or shape is primary. What comes in and what goes out has a size and a shape and an interpreter. So there's something that's interpreting all of this at the cellular level. And it's not the DNA. The DNA can be used. The DNA is like the library at the center of the cell that can be read and interpreted and put to use. So I'm just wondering how much of this scales up to our social worlds. I think an awful lot. And I believe, and my curiosity is what's inside our boundary as a group? What is outside our boundary as a group? And I believe that's extremely improvisatory, the inside and the outside of groups. And I believe it's becoming particularly difficult to discern when we're living in this kind of techno explosion right now, which is so much dominating our social worlds right now. So anyway, I'm just putting all that out there and hoping we can add to the I, we, it's kind of framework that Wilbur uses a lot. Add to that those different kinds of Aristotelian causes, and have this sort of an update of what final causes could mean in our contemporary world, where it has been abandoned and marginalized by science. Final causes have not been allowed for a long time now, but I think that's starting to break down. Anyway, that's my spiel. Thank you for giving me this chance to rehearse these very difficult ideas.
I don't know much about Aristotle and final causes, and I guess what I'm about to say might go against what you were just saying. But in light of where we are now, or perhaps in light of where I am right now, I'm thinking there is no final cause, and you pretty much just stated that to a certain degree, that there's various structures, various levels, various sizes to consider, various internals and externals. So when I'm thinking of final causes and the question Ed asked, like, what do we mean by the future? So a final cause to me sounds final, and that means and I know you would not be one to say that would be final. But what does that mean? When there's so many levels.
You want to have a baby. What has to happen for you to have a baby? That's what a final cause is. It's getting everything together so that that baby can happen.
Mm-hmm. And I'm still contemplating that after 5 years of having a baby. Uh-huh. So there's the recent knowledge of what Donna Haraway talks about, and Mark made me aware of this later. Earlier in the year.
Them. We didn't have them.
Exactly.
I think final cause, that's what I meant by a final cause. It's not that abstract. It's actually very concrete.
Right.
It's very everyday, actually. You're hungry, you want to get something to eat, that's the final cause. But there are many other kinds of causes that are involved in making that happen. But it's not arbitrary or chaotic. We're not flying by the seat of our pants. There can be rules, but the rules also, if the system gets very, very complex, they change. So we can't obey those rules. That's when we get into those path dependencies as I think he's pointing out with the bigger and better yam that tribe fell in love with. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Doug.
No, I think we would all agree that Aristotle had his own definition then, and so it can mean a definite final cause. But we as humans trekking through the earth are going to have constant cause and recause and thoughts about the causes we've caused.
I think the word final is probably it's a little misleading in this in this instance. Really, I think what Aristotle meant by that is your purpose. It's you. You are the final cause, essentially. Why does it matter? To whom does it matter? And so it's in the history of philosophy, though, and what I think John is referring to is that the way that things work, or the causality, the explanation for why things happen, has been separated from from human purpose, from final causes. So if we brought that back, we wouldn't call it final cause because it's not really final. But it's like, what do we want is a way of introducing final cause. Because what is this planet here for? Is it here for machines to, take over and extract all the resources and then, colonize the whole galaxy, embedding computers in every single atom or something like that, like this? Or is it here for, living beings to enjoy and to live out their lives and experience life? I mean, that's the role of the final cause in the stories that we weave around what this is all about. I think is the point. But the word final is, of course, definitely not final. It's more like what is the purpose? Yeah,
it's like a purpose, teleology, a purpose.
Yeah, and I guess and our purposes could be provisional as well. They can change, they can evolve.
And revisable, for sure. But that's why I was saying I get an allergic reaction to the idea of machine learning, because does a machine have a final cause? Does a machine have a purpose? How does a machine evolve if it doesn't have any? That's a big question mark for me. And I'm really open to a controversial differences, perhaps. But I think there's a huge difference between the biotic systems, such as ourselves, and abiotic systems. And I don't think you're going to have an army of drones who are going to be driven by moral impulses, such as our biotic systems, I think, at our best should be. And I think that's where I find myself getting very confused by all of this AI, which comes out of, I think, a first order systems theory. I do believe we could have, at a second order, and I think this is something Davor was saying too, at a second order systems, there would be enough persons who were engaged in the creation of these kinds of machines to take into considerations questions about ecology and culture, which at a first order is not able to do or doesn't do. And I think that's the shift. So I'm not against technology, obviously not, or we wouldn't be having a conversation like this. But what kind of technology and the differences that make a difference to whom? There has to be, seems to me, something for the biotic to do. Or is this experiencing body just a dead end? As a lot of biologists who, praise Darwin, I think, and probably, or Adam Smith, if you're a capitalist, I think they would probably say, yeah, it is a dead end. Let's upload our consciousness and let's beam ourselves out of here. I think that's a myth. Some find it very compelling. I don't.
I think in order to make the final cause, either for our individual self or the six of us here right now, or the we that we define ourselves as. Machine learning will be the climate science that gets more precise on predicting the futures. In order for us to make that final cause decision, we will need to be accepting of and critical of any and all decisions that impede on our final cause. So those of us that have an aversion towards machine learning that can be brought into our final cause can take that into account, along with the advocacy for the body, taking that into account, taking into account all the other 10 million various strands. So I guess if we're asking ourselves about the futures, the final causes, then we're also speaking of how do we educate ourselves about the most educated final cause we can think of. And that would require quite a bit of accepting the full spectrum of whatever it might be. And our machine friends can be our friends if we want it to be. Of course, on the larger scale, it hasn't been, or doesn't seem it will be.
Well, I think another word for final cause is vision. You need a vision as an individual and as a member of a collective.
Right. And
in order to maintain some sort of sense making.
I just want to say also I'm on the phone, so my vision is pretty poor. So I see fingers whenever I scroll between the 2 or 3 frames that I have to scroll from. I didn't see Mark's finger, or maybe Michael had something to say, so I apologize if you're waiting on me to call on you or something like that. Chime on in.
Go ahead, Mark.
I want to get back to John's metaphor about the house. In some ways, it's related to, we're talking about final causes, and a long time ago, Marco mentioned ultimate reality, and John questioned, what do you mean by ultimate? I think those are similar. So, but let's stay with the house metaphor. And I'm not a big fan of metaphor. I think you should use them only when you're out of other alternatives. But if we stay with the how, what we're really talking about is shelter. Human beings need shelter. That's part of what allows us to continue living. And we use technology to build shelters. We used to live in a cave. Everybody kind of agrees. And then you don't, Michael? We didn't live in a cave? Well, at some point we lived in a cave. Some of us, probably those who survived, and the climate changed, and those who had shelter can better deal with climate changes. And, there are still people who in tropical regions live in, their shelter is made out of woven materials. In the northern climates, they dig a hole in the ice, and that's the shelter. But part of our ability, our human ability to survive, was shelter. We absolutely needed shelter, or we would not have lost all our fur. And because animal creatures who don't have shelter, they need friggin' fur. or not. One of my, we are called by some the naked ape, but we could not have gotten there without shelter. And so and then the technology and the shelters, they've gotten more. Like I live in what I think is, the new Green Deal. I live in the most modern of shelters. Everything is environmental, it's efficient, it's amazing, the shelter I live in. It really is. I don't know if it's earthquake proof, but it probably is. And it's probably hurricane proof. It's an amazing, but it's only 2 years old. So shelter is supremely important, but it's not and I hate to use the word evolved. I think part of our problem is language. Evolution can be a noun, it can be a verb, and people conflate the two, and they use them differently. So I'm going to stop right there and let Michael go.
I'm not sure how much I have to add. I'm not disagreeing that human beings needed shelter, and some of them found caves. I've just, of the naturalist perspective, that they use whatever material from the environment to create shelter. Now, they could have found a cave, that's true. But I'm imagining that most of them had to deal with spur of the moment. Put up a tent, or you look at around different indigenous cultures across the world, from Tibet to Amazons, they take what's ever available in the environment to create shelter. So you're right, Mark. I just don't go the extreme of necessary cave being the only medium for shelter. In terms of trying to tie this into DeVore and his studying of humanoids creating this technology to work with their environment, to live in it, from spears, everything, that from just simple art, that I think art came along to help them create these technology. I sometimes don't understand the split between technology and art, because I think they kind of rose at the same time, because it took an artistic perception to decide, can I take this stick? Can I make this? Can I do this? That's an artistic perception to me. That's paying attention to your environment. Something came online to help human beings with their brain development to not be a victim of their environment. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I think, and this was, I think somebody, or Ed, objected to his overall theory. I think his overall theory was, and you just articulated it, Michael, in that human beings solve the problem right in front of them. And up until recently, maybe, somewhere in the modern age, they started to think about the future. But for most of our existence, human beings solved whatever problem was right in front of them without much forethought. In other words, I'm cold, how can I remedy that if I don't get and they didn't even know about anything. It's just they started to shiver, and then, animal fur might keep me warm. Somebody came, and who knows how they came up with that. And so those things, that was his, I think, one of his major themes was that we humans were able to look at what's the threat, what's the problem, and yeah, in my immediate environment, how can I solve this problem so that I can, you know, see the sun come up tomorrow.
As time passed, that kind of built on itself, I think, not in a recursive way where they started creating better technology and stuff. But I still disagree that the Greeks at one point, I think Ed pointed this out or somebody pointed it out, the Greeks thought of art and tech as joined until such time they began to more deal with the technology. Technology became, I need a gun, I need a weapon, I need a shelter, because they began to accelerate through technology their ability to stay alive, and lost the sense of art as being part of the environment. And when they went technological, they started separating themselves from the environment and they began to conquer it. And we're still in that place. Maybe we're trying to evolve where we come full circle and try to bring the two back together. Does that make sense, Mark?
I was with you up to a point.
Okay.
I think that makes sense.
What point?
Go ahead.
That makes sense,
Go ahead.
Mike.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, Michael. But I want to add to this. Let's look at, we talked about the house and the different causes that are involved, according to Aristotle, in that house making sense communally for that house to happen. Now, I can imagine, you know, a few of my friends getting together and building a shack, you know, something that will do maybe over a, you know, like a summer, but we're never going to get together and make a ballpoint pen. That's just not going to happen. And I think this is something that larger and larger systems start to organize around different kinds of final causes. We could also think about a ballpoint pen, a house. We could think about a military conflict. And I'm getting this example from Biosemiotics by author Jesper Hoffmeyer. And I think it's tantalizing to think about. He's talking about a military conflict. He's talking once again about material, efficient, formal, and final causes. So what has to happen for a military conflict to happen? He says, weapons constitute the material cause. Soldiers compromise efficient cause. Armies' placement with respect to the particularities of the landscape becomes final cause. Excuse me, formal cause. That's sort of like the blueprint of a house. You have to have some sort of military strategy. And he says the final cause will consist of the actual intersection of particular social, political, and economic conflicts. So I think that final cause is very tantalizing when you think about what we're doing here. Because I think, you know, when we think about a framework or we think about something that we want to study together, and we all come from different backgrounds and we have different interests, well, how do we come up with an idea? And I believe that having a sense of a purpose and a final cause, if you want to change that vocabulary, it's fine with me, but I think that we have to somehow figure out how to do this with this technology in ways that do not become easily manipulated by nefarious forces who just want to make a buck off of complex relationships, which is what groups are. They're complex and sometimes stable, sometimes unstable. But I think we have to move away from this kind of thing orientation to something that's more relational. And that's hard for us to do because I think we've been educated to think about things and the manipulation of things in a very outsider kind of way. And we've ignored the interior spaces at our peril, I believe. So anyway, that's my spiel. I hope that made sense to somebody.
Well, it does, John, and I'm just going to probably push my constant button that when we begin to notice interiors and spaces, we're dealing with very biological, primal mechanisms in themselves, as far as mechanisms, something that keeps repeating. And sometimes we don't take the time to stop and go, wait a minute. Just because somebody's different or from a different group, I don't necessarily have to feel threatened. Now, I will never, ever say that I'm a hippie on steroids in the sense that I love people, but my antenna is up of how much I can trust somebody from another group or another person. But I have an ethic that I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I have to merge my instincts with my training skill of bringing together my rationality. Well, is this person really a threat, or have I been taught by my parents and society that gay people are not to be dealt with, black people, women, whatever, rather than me challenging my indoctrination, my socialization, and saying, well, how true is this? Well, it may be true in some circumstances, but not in all circumstances. So this is the issue that I have worked with in my life, from hitchhiking across America to being a bouncer in a coffee shop to being married to, all my relational contacts have been how to fine tune that and also take ownership, responsibility for me not questioning how I was conditioned to respond to a certain difference. Sense make? Thank you.
No. Can I add something here? I want to go back 2 steps first. When I hate to keep using the same example, but it's so very plastic and it's something that we can all relate to. But when a company is trying to formulate a strategy, for example, the question it's actually asking itself is the question that every one of us asks at some point in our life, and that is, what do I want to be when I grow up? That is strategy in a nutshell. What do I want to be when I grow up? And whatever answer I have at any point in time is, in essence, the final cause that Aristotle talks about and John made us. It's just what I want to have come out at the end of this particular moment of thinking about it. When I was a real, I have a 4-year-old here in the house, and for the longest time he wanted to be a power shovel operator. He wanted to be one of those guys in a big machine, went out and dug holes. Well, he doesn't want to be that anymore. He now wants to be a train driver, because you can go fast and you can go far, you can do a lot of things. So he's changed this idea of what he wants to become when he grows up. And we do that throughout our lives, especially through our childhood. And young companies change their idea of what it is that they want to be when they grow up as well. But at some point, you get kind of let's not say a fixed idea,
but you get a strong idea of what it is you want to be. Maybe you want to be an actor. Maybe you want to be a teacher. You know, maybe you want to be a bouncer in a coffee shop. You know, it could be any one of these things. But the moment that you decide that, you internalize it, you make it part of yourself. Every decision you make is guided and directed, and I'm going to use the word guardedly, but I'm going to use it, determined by that idea. It's not just the external circumstances. They predispose me to certain things that I can do. But the idea that I want to be something when I grow up guides and influences every direction, every decision that I make. And that is in itself an anterior future working upon ourselves. Now, just to clear up a misunderstanding that seems to be still amongst this group, I'm not against anything that Loeffler has to say. My only comment was I didn't get it. That's all. But I get a lot more of it now because all of you folks have been talking about it, and I've been reading that, and I'm going, okay, things are becoming clearer for me. I'm not against anything that he has to say. I think he has important things to say. I may not agree with all the important things that he has to say, but I really think that we're on the same general lambda on where it, you know, we need to think about these things. And this is the same thing that I think Gapser talks about when he talks about latency and transparency. He says the future determines our present because we make decisions in light of what we think that future is going to be. What Loeffler I hear is saying is maybe we should give a little more thought and be a little more conscious about what we want that future to be or how we think it can manifest. And a company that has an idea like that, and many times the word vision falls. That's why I understand the use of the word vision, but if you use it in a corporate context, it gets a little tainted, okay, sometimes, but it's actually the idea. I just have this idea, this thought in my mind, this is what I want to be. I want to be the world's biggest retailer. You know, that is a vision. It may not be a good one. That was Amazon's. That's what Jeff Bezos, yes, what? Read his business plan, Mark. That's what Jeff Bezos said when he went looking for venture capital. I want to be the world's biggest retailer. The interesting part about Amazon is they're, in the meantime, probably close to it, but over the course of their history, they made way more money, way more. It was the only segment of their business that was profitable in developing online applications for others and providing web services and servers and IT infrastructure and things that has nothing to do with that vision per se. But if it keeps me alive because I have a cash cow that will allow me to survive, then it serves the vision. And so it does make a certain amount of sense in the end. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate way to go about what you do. Now, what the consequences of it, the ethical concern, I don't care about any of that right now. It's the idea that I have an idea or I have a notion of what I want to become. And my decisions will all be directed toward that. If I change that, if I decide I don't want to become a policeman, I want to become a teacher, I'm going to start making different decisions about what I do and every opportunity that I have to make a decision. So I am being influenced by that future that I have envisioned. And if Devore is saying, let's get clearer on what that is, I'm all for it. I think it's a huge undertaking. I think it's a very complex undertaking. It's one that's going to take a lot of time. And it's not a criticism when I say, because he says it himself, if we don't make certain decisions now, we don't have a long-term future to think about. So we're kind of in a different kind of bind in that regard. But that to me is what final causes are about and how they affect what we do. And I don't think Aristotle was all that wrong, but you know, read him 2,500 years later and we get a different view of what we think he said. But the essence of what he said is still very effective. Arthur Young
loves Aristotle's four causes and goes to great lengths to show how that fits into how he decides where he thinks we're going as humanity, or not, or whatever, his whole idea of evolution. You see, so these all play in there. We have to understand how they contextualize together, I think, more than anything else. That's all.
Yeah, so I just want to bring what I'm listening down to a personal expression. I think the theme is going on in terms of the future and what you just said, Ed. And so I'm going to use my personal experience in the sense that both times when I had to have hip surgery, I had to mentally do, what do I want to be on the other side of the surgery? What do I want? What kind of mind state? You know, I had to, what's in front of me is a surgery that makes me really uncomfortable, a fact. And so I had to bring certain strategies, what I call strategies of thinking, contact with my body. And I don't know if I probably shared it, 2 weeks before both surgeries, I began to pay attention to the upcharge of anxiety of the future event, anticipate. So anxiety and anticipation go with me. They're kind of two sides of the same coin, even though anticipation is more an action and anxiety is the motion. 2 weeks before, I was noticing how each time I thought about that surgery, my anxiety would go up. I felt it in my bones. So I brought into play certain awareness trainings of how to, okay, yeah, Mike, yeah, you got 12 days, you got, you know, for the future operation. And that helped me, I think, overall have a better result of healing because I wasn't letting the anxiety dictate the future event. I also came across that 3 days before, I went and had a massage for my body to actually help my body lessen the anticipation. And so what I'm saying on a very downscaled way, I think that fits into the large scale, I think is what I'm trying to see if that fits in, and how these micro practices for everybody could help maybe in a, what's the word for it? A butterfly effect, you know, that at least that's the way I'm thinking of it.
Yeah, I hear you. What I'm thinking about in this, as I've been listening to this, talking about first person, I guess when I was about 12 years old when I decided I wanted to be an actor. It was because I saw a performance in the theater that just stunned me. I want to do that. And so I went to the library and I read every play that was ever written. I read it, and I read a whole lot more besides that. And it just became a driver. And then, you know, I was also gay, and that had something to do with why I was drawn to theater, because a lot of gay people are invisible in the outer world, but in the arts, they have found a niche. They've constructed niches for themselves. And a lot of gay people were in theater and show business and in the arts. So that was another thing. I was interested in community. And none of this was articulated particularly well. I didn't sit down and, you know, but I was basically just using my imagination and saying, what feels good? This feels bad, this feels good. I'm gonna go for what makes me feel good. So I ended up in New York, ended up acting, had my own theater company for a while. I joined other theater companies. I did some tours. And then in my early 30s, the AIDS epidemic hit, and many of my friends are dying. And I had to realize, and I started to realize that the identity was changing, because I could no longer justify trying to create an acting career when so many of my peers were dying of a very mysterious disease that nobody knew about. So I think there's an element of indeterminance of uncertainty, of randomness, of chaos, and we have to deal with that. And I believe our identities are not stable and fixed, but they change over a lifetime. If you live long enough, you know, well, that career no longer satisfies me because conditions have changed. And I have to figure out even in this midst of great uncertainty, what I want to have happen. So I have to, affiliate, create new relationships, orchestrate events together to move forward what we as a group want to have happen. You don't get to put on a dance or a piece of theater or a gallery full of interesting art by yourself. It's not something you do solo. You have to have a community that supports these kinds of individual self-expression. So I'm just saying it's very fluid, and we're open systems, and we're moving in precarious environments often, and there are existential threats, and we have to sometimes make changes. So that's why I'm of the belief. This is a belief, and it's a belief that could change. But I think we're much more about becoming than we are about maintaining a stable identity. I think we are creatures that are in flux and in flow states, and some are extremely agreeable, and some of them are very disagreeable. And I do believe our imaginations are pivotal. If we can imagine, I can imagine this, feels really good. There's nothing in my environment to support it, but fuck my environment. I want it anyway, and I'm going to keep going until I find people who agree with me. So there's a certain in a situation of enormous uncertainty, hope is not just hype. It actually can create conditions. If enough people share that hope with you, you can create conditions, you can change systems. What was illegal can become legal. And I think this is something ongoing for all of us. And I think it's very precarious right now because of this technology and the new relationships that are emerging, and our new identities probably are, and our old identities are falling apart as we create new identities that can handle this kind of complexity. And I think it's extremely intense. So thanks.
I'd like to return to the theme of shelter then, because shelter can operate on multiple levels. And there could be physical shelter like a house or a cave. But I think at the level that we have to think, obviously that's a concern for many people still. That's not figured out on a social scale. But we have to think about the planet as a kind of shelter. Like that cave, we can exist on this planet because of a thin film of atmosphere, very, very thin. If you were to, I went to a demonstration once, and it was like a big beach ball. And how thick is the atmosphere on that beach ball? Like this big? It's like just like a sliver of paper. So it is precarious. And it's an unstable system, and it's an outside that provides an inside. And even though we have to live out and pursue our purposes on personal levels and social levels, I mean, small groups like this, something about us has to hold the awareness that those purposes are possible, are playing out, and are even possible because of this larger objective context. And that's a view that we've gotten through science and technology. That it's given us the ability to physically see the objective planetary context. But then cognitively and in our consciousness as humans, we then have to work out the implications of that. We form a picture. And then that becomes our map, that becomes our larger landscape of where we're trying to work out our futures. So when I think about vision, and if your vision is to become the largest retailer on the planet, and that's what you're about, and you become successful in that, that doesn't necessarily maintain the shelter. That doesn't necessarily take into account the larger perspectives that are actually operative and that affect your ability to sell products and to have social interactions, whatever it is. So, I mean, I think what we're going through as awareness, as a species, is this. I'm going to struggle a little bit with just saying this. So let me just be messy for a little while I work it out. But that having a vision of the whole, and then orienting your activities individually, in groups, as societies, as nations, internationally, in a way that comports with that objective reality, that this shelter we have to maintain, somebody has to take responsibility for it, right? So who is going to take responsibility for the earth? The United States government, the United Nations, Russia, China, who's actually thinking about it? And compared to who's thinking about their final purposes, like a military objective or strategic business objective, or so who's actually holding that awareness? And I think that that's where artists, writers, theorists, and others who are not fixated on, not committed, not pre-committed to particular objectives, like a business goal or whatever, which may be important in a larger scale, like that. Those kinds of groups or those kinds of networks can propagate a bigger vision that reorients how human beings exist, because that's what has to objectively happen. We have to live a different way on the planet in mass. And so how does that understanding of how to live on a planet, in a cosmos, actually become propagated to a wider community? That to me would be a purpose to have. That would be, to me, would be a vision to move towards.
Can I respond to that? I think that also is coming out of a second order culture, which you've just articulated. I believe being the largest retailer on the planet is coming out of a first order culture. From the outsider manipulating events, finding resources, extracting them, not paying back anything, trying to maximize your profits at the expense of others is fine. That's just business. I also think that there's a difference between being the largest retailer may be a value, just like making money can be a value. It could even become a mission, but it is not a vision. I say a vision has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the largest other you can possibly imagine. Some may have called this God, but I realize a lot of people have an allergy to that expression. But I think the challenge is how to move towards vision. And I think David was saying this. He says Beethoven, a musician came up to him, a violinist came up to Beethoven and said, "There, Beethoven, I can't play this passage. It's too high for my violin." And Beethoven wrapped himself in his cloak and he says, "Do you think when the spirit speaks to me, I care about your puny fiddle?" And I think what Davor is saying was Beethoven had a vision. And in that Romantic era, a lot of people thought, well, genius and madness are pretty related. But I think Davor was saying that there was something from the outside that Beethoven was responding to. And he sacrificed a great deal of personal happiness to make that happen. He was not a happy camper. A lot of visionaries are pretty miserable people, actually. But I think he said, this all is, it isn't arbitrary. That Bach was composing for a harpsichord, Mozart was composing for a pianoforte, And Beethoven was composing for a piano. These were all technological innovations, and they're moving in a direction. You don't have a baby grand, a grand piano does not come before a harpsichord. There's a direction, and there are interiors. Different kinds of performers, different kinds of composers are going to interact with, are going to be shaped by that technology, and they're going to change that technology as they're shaped by it. And I think this is where the field of all possibilities, if we can center ourselves and commune, make contact with the vision, and share that, we probably would be moving towards something that I think you were articulating so well, Marco. When we start thinking about this, the incredible fragility of the biosphere, as we start, as these coal plants come on, and they're polluting even further, and we already know, this is what Devar was saying, we already know what the results of this behavior is going to be: disaster. And this is what the politicians keep doing. Is what they know won't work, but they do it anyway. And I think it's a case of maybe post-traumatic stress, or people are just freezing because they just don't know what to do. And when you don't know what to do, you just do what you've already done before in a kind of panic-stricken state. So I think we need to sort of cultivate a sense of well-being, even in the midst of all of these controversies and stressors, so that we can mobilize our resources collectively, rather than responding going into a panic attack mode. And really, I do believe it's like shooting yourself in the foot and trying to run a relay race. That would be my metaphor of the day. So anyway, thanks.
Well, and I think, to go back to something that Marco brought up and you brought up, is the largest organ in our body is our skin. That is the membrane that contains everything within us, but at the same time, it's coexisting with the outside world. And I think it goes with the notion of shelter, of having that extra layer, trying to know that there's limits to our skin and our bodies, and telling us, and we need to have build another layer. But there is a downside if we don't pay attention, and this is just from my own work. We don't pay attention, we're imprisoned by the extra shelter that we build. And we should never let something that we build to protect us imprison us. Help us, aid us, but this technology, like all you've been messing with and talking about, I think this is what we're struggling with, the danger. What is this? Is this technology going to aid us, or is it going to imprison us and probably destroy us if we're not careful?
And this is what I think David was talking about when he talked about path dependency and systems transitions, and how that tends to come from the outside, because the system only knows how to do what it knows how to do. Mm-hmm. And I believe from the outside, there may be pressures that create the conditions where something else has to happen. And that's what we call learning.
Yeah.
And if you live long enough, you learn how you learn.
Yeah.
And there are going to be lots of variables depending on, the conversations you're having with the people you're with, and all the different kinds of boundaries that you make, both permeable, and hopefully they're as permeable as you can make them, so that you can learn something.
Right.
And I think that's the tension we're in. I think it's a dynamic tension, and it can be a very creative one. But I think that our relationships with one another and the kind of boundaries that occur, whether that's dyadic or triadic or groups, those boundaries can be very fluid and kind of mysterious. And in therapy world, we talk about the safe container. We want the if it's a group therapy or if it's a one-on-one therapy, you want to create a safe enough container so that there is a sense of shelter, there's a sense of home. And then I can create opportunities in this very uncertain and indeterminate circumstances I might be in to move more fluidly and more creatively than if I get hunkered down in neuromuscular lock and try to rely on previous programs that aren't going to work anymore.
Well, and that's why, John, you know, coming from the place I come from, is everything you said is true, but the added component I would say is Aikido, learning how to move when you are threatened, where you are not activated and reactive and defensive, but you are there's a fluidity to defending yourself when need be, as much as a fluidity to move through the world when you don't have to worry about it. And fortunately, you know, that's one thing I've added is I need a safe container to learn to be relaxed, like you said, and release the tension and conditioning. But then when I leave, per se, the dojo where I learned that, I also have to interact with a different type of sphere, a larger sphere of people that don't have my mentality or my ability. You know, they're reactive themselves, and I have to place myself in you're reactive, I get it, but this is what I'm going to have to do, you know, through talking and stuff. So it's a tension of being creative and being creative even when we have to protect ourselves when need be, but not be imprisoned in our unconscious creativity of protecting ourselves, if I can say it that way. Because we have a lot of unconscious systems online to protect ourselves, and they're automatic. They're just as bad as the technology of they mirror machines. We have automatic conditioning defaults to protect ourselves that we need to take back and decide how do we operate with them. And that's a learning how to learn. There's a learning in that. And it's very strongly possible because I've saved my butt many times because of that skill of, especially with my brother who came at me and wanted to beat the shit out of me. And by that time I learned duck and cover, put him on the ground. And he stayed on the ground. But I still love him. Like I said, I can be a hippie on steroids. Yes, Mark.
I would like to try and narrow, refocus this, because I think we missed it in the last one, talking about Loeffler. And John, you just brought it up about music, how important music is. And everybody, consensus in some circles seems to be that Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, these what we call classical musicians, were the apex of music. Well, where are we now with, you know, hip hop? Are we going forward? Are we going? What the hell is happening? You know, I have my preference for music. It's not classical. It's not hip hop. It's you know, it's folk. It's grounded in sort of singer songwriter Bob Dylan and onward from there. So, but I don't think anybody can argue that music isn't fundamental to the human experience, bonds us together in a tribal way. People segregate with regard to music. So I just wanted to, you know, kind of, and Loeffler, he spoke a lot about the evolution of music. Well, I would like a discussion about that, because we all have different preferences, unless we don't have access to other types of music. I think all of us now, at least most of us, have access to every type of music there is. And what music moves you, why and when, and how it influences you, certainly influences film, which has a huge influence on people. So I don't want to discount, Michael, your last segment, but I just want to kind of bring it back to fundamental, ultimate, final causes. Music is huge.
Well, I just want to respond to that music and sports are about movement. So I can do an Aikido dancing to Bob Dylan any day if you want to show up, and I'll show you. So they both have a common it's about movement, whether it's from the inside out or sharing it. It's about movement. It's just that music has instruments or voice. But in my learning, all my instructors told me that martial arts is a dance. Maybe the music is inside of you, but it has a dance. And dance and music, I'll just put it together that way, Mark. So I get it. I go along with you.
I think it's a good point you made, Mark. And I think simply reflecting on our musical affiliations. I recently read an article, I can't remember where it was. It was about music, and scientifically, if you will, we don't really know why music moves us. There's lots of ideas of why it could be and how it is, and there's things that you like, and I'm sure that our tastes are probably more similar than they are to others. And we can look back and we can talk about Mozart and Bach and Beethoven. I don't think any of the six of us who happen to be on the screen right now think that was the apex, and we've degenerated since then. I would be willing to bet, because I've seen, Marco has brought up things where some music moved him in some way. He shared that with us. He put music to poetry that he's done. So there's this, we're still using it in some way, because it's extremely important not to think that this is an absolute. I think that's Davor's real point. It's not an absolute. It is moving, but we don't take it into consideration perhaps as much as we should. When Marco mentioned that it's actually artists and art that are kind of driving us along this, let's do something about the planetary, if I can put it in such simple terms, he's got a point, because the narrow focus that we generally get from academic, scientific approaches to things doesn't help us move along that way, because there's too many places where you can sit down and argue about, is there human-induced climate change or is there not? Well, you just get involved in a discussion that really doesn't get you anywhere, because the clock is ticking and we've got a problem that we need to address. But we're not addressing the problem. We're only talking about what the problem might even be. But we know that there's a problem there. We don't have to talk about that part of it. We need to talk about something else in there. And I also, I just last Sunday night, I saw a TV program. I don't watch much TV. But there's a detective criminal whodunit show on German TV every Sunday night at 8:15. It's been running since 1975. It uses the same title music that it used back then. They wanted to change it about 6 years ago, and there was such an outcry from the populace that they let it go.
Okay, so when you look at this show, you're still seeing the same lead in with the same title music that you saw 40 years ago. And it's just called The Scene of the Crime. That's what it's called. And they have these different commissars that do that. And I love to watch this because it's basically somebody gets killed, nobody knows why. Well, let's figure it out. It's getting a little surreal here as we move along, because they're thinking, well, we have to entice our audience. I'm still a big whodunit fan. I like Agatha Christie novels. I like P.D. James. Those kinds of things. I'm kind of a classicist in that regard. But anyway, right before that, there's a show that comes on. It's at 3/4 of an hour, and it's called Terra X. It's the unknown Earth. And they always have these really odd things. They have one guy that he goes all over the world. They did like a 4-part series on Russia, on the nature, the landscape, the resource, what is that all about? They did a 3-part thing on Canada. They did a 6-part thing on Germany, where I learned things about this. It's a little country, by comparison. It's only about as big as Montana. But a diversity of landscapes and geology and weather and climate and whatnot. Well, the last 3 weeks, they've been doing a day in the life of series. So they did a day in the life of a midwife in Cologne in 1635. And kind of brought to life in these 45 minutes, what was it like to have been a midwife back then? What was life like? What was the culture like? How did people live? What did they do? And how did she get through this? And of course, they were, accused of being witches because they knew about herbs and whatnot. So they built on them. But the last one was the one I found most fascinating. It was just this last one. It was about a wig maker in Paris in 1775. And they kind of showed life in Paris. This is the time of the American Revolution, and what was this, there was all of the hierarchical stati in the French culture. There were certain kinds of wigs you could have, and, what you were allowed to wear, what they were made of, and those kinds of things. But there was a transition going on at this time. And the transition was because wigs were going out of style in Europe at that time. And Paris was the center of, the haute couture, as we like to say. And they're going out. And so this guy is looking for a way to sustain his own family business. He's a 10th generation wig maker. And he can see the end of his livelihood and his trade on the horizon. And he's looking for ways to overcome this. And he comes up with this really wild idea to do hairstyling for women. Now, at the time, men weren't allowed to touch women that they weren't married to. So you have to find some way to get around all of these social mores or whatnot. But he's a really creative individual. This is all based on documentation. And he comes up with this idea of stacking hair, not just their own. We do this today. We call them extensions today. Okay. We put hair into heads where it doesn't belong, and we do things with it. And he was stacking hair on heads because the whole idea was this was the upper class. You had to get people that could pay for this. Okay. This is back where people are killing each other because there's not enough flour to make bread, and the wig makers are buying tons of flour to flour wigs. Okay. For the aristocracy. There's a little bit of tension in society about something as simple as flour. So he starts stacking this hair up, and that was the change that came. This was the shift that was made. And it reminded me of the yam story. Because the whole idea about growing this big yam was originally to solve the problem of hunger. But it lost that and became some absurd whatever it was. Well, stacking hair up on women's head was not solving any problem at all. It might have been a personal problem for him because he wanted to save his business. But there's no existential problem involved in this.
It's a purely artistic endeavor, and the purpose, the final cause. I'll use this. The final cause was social recognition by those women who had the hair stacked on their head. This isn't really doing anything for anybody, but it becomes a significant shift in thinking, or it's a result of a significant shift in thinking. I don't know which one. This is during the Enlightenment. I'm going to get off. But it went to the extreme, because here's my point. It went to the extreme that they designed hairdos, if you will, coiffure, for these women, that they could no longer stand up. It would pull them over and flop them on the floor. They had to be held up by their maidens so that they wouldn't fall over because of their hairdos. Now, I'll take a big yam as to this other one, which is absolutely insane when you think about it. In that regard.
I would just say that supports Loeffler's position that the dude who invented the hair, came up with that, he was solving an immediate problem for himself. In other words, how do I continue living now that my flower wig thing is being eliminated? So he came up with a device. He wasn't forward thinking that it caused women to fall over or anything. He just was solving an immediate problem for himself. And that led to a cultural phenomenon.
Right. I think we're talking about like shared symbols. Like was it Madame Pompadour? Wasn't she the one who had that? Yeah.
As the name implies.
Yes, yes. So we have these artifacts that we study, from other cultures, and we try to imagine what was going on in these people's minds, that they created these bigger and bigger yams that had no nutritional value, or these gigantic headpieces, to satisfy someone's seeking status. These are social symbols. So, and we're doing that today, and I'm sure future generations will look back at us and saying, what were these people coming from? And I think that we something that William Connolly said about the French Revolution, which is often overlooked, was that there was a volcano in, I think it was Nova Scotia, but that it created a blanket of toxic dust, which blocked the sun for about 2 years. The peasants had no crops. And that was right before that Bastille Day, where those
flour for wigs.
Yeah, and a lot of those ladies with those wigs had their heads chopped off. So I think that's what happens when these systems transitions, these path dependencies, we get hooked on these shared symbols, and we get addicted to fossil fuels, maybe to our computers, to cars, to all the things, all the status symbols. And I think that's where we're, what I think Dave was pointing out, and how do we, these transitions, are really, really tricky and extremely painful. I don't think people make them because, oh, wouldn't it be fun to just have a new cosmology today? I think people only come up with a new cosmology because they have to. And I think that's, hopefully we don't have to have something like the French Revolution. I hope we can create conditions for something a little more, so this civilizational shift he's talking about can happen without all that bloodshed. But it's not going to be easy. And I think the more we hunker down and study and practice and try to create, compelling futures as individuals, that I believe has some impact that's useful.
Yeah, I believe one conversation at a time can help the world. One conversation at a time. And the difficulty, though, and sometimes, is how to hold the tension that comes up in the conversations. And again, just using our intuition and instincts of discerning what conversations we want to get into with whom, because some we need to stay away from till such time they smoke some pot and chill out.
It's easier said than done in some places, Michael. Now,
I know, Ed, I know, but maybe they should have a beer then. I don't know.
it's not the same, I can tell you. But anyway,
Okay.
Since we're getting close to the top of the hour, I just wanted to throw in one small thing, since there are a number of themes and topics that have come up that are certainly worth exploring further. And one that I would like to just have articulated, just so that we know. We talk about AI, and we talk about AI, and we talk about learning, but it's not clear to me. Simply, it is not clear to me what is meant by the word learning when it is used in that context. John pointed out a couple of things that are probably a good starting point for some considerations in that area. I just happen to be, I'm catching up with the Bateson readings here on the side, and I read about his Deutero learning, the essay where he brings that up, which is also another angle to consider in this whole thing. So when we say that they're learning, what do we mean? And when we say they're evolving, this comes back to what Mark had brought up very early in our conversation. What does that mean? Because just because we've learned something new, have we evolved? Have we developed? You know, there's a whole slew of vocabulary, if you will, that we tend to use. I'm not saying we have to all agree on how we use them, but we should be at least aware of the fact that we are sometimes conflating things that we should probably be keeping apart, which is another point Mark made. I think it is well worth keeping in mind. That's all.
And I just want to say, I got Jeremy Johnson's book yesterday, and I'm about third way through, and I'm loving it. It's a good book.
This is the Gebser, Introduction to Gebser book?
Yes, it's a very good book. Jeremy has a knack that I love. I love that his knack for words and putting things together.
He could join us for a cafe.
That's cool.
With others, yeah. To the question, just quickly on the question of learning before we close. I mean, of course, machine learning, I use that in quotes, it's not the same as human learning, because there isn't a knower that is experiencing the gains inside or outside or what have you. Nonetheless, it's a thing. It's real. And so how does a system, not a person, recognize like what a picture is of, like a picture of a cat? How does Facebook know that, how can it know who you are just by looking at a picture of you? So it learned, quote unquote, learned to do that. And it wasn't told. That's the difference that we're talking about, is that in, let's say, classical traditional programming, you the programmer, the person who's coding the machine, who's telling it what to do, is dictating each step in the process. First do A, then B, then C, and then you end up at Z. Well, okay. But I mean, the idea of machine learning is that the computer figures out how to organize itself by trial and error, essentially. Like through, that's what big data is for. Something called big data is look at 1 million, billion, pictures of cats, and then the computer starts forming like logic trees as to like which assumptions that it's making are correct. And sometimes the programmers don't even know how it's doing that. But through this kind of iterative process where it makes a guess or a series of guesses, and then those that are actually reinforced by the feedback loop of being correct, those get strengthened, the assumptions behind those are strengthened. It goes through another round, another round, another round. And that's how machine learning works. But then take that capability and put it in the hand of Jeff Bezos. And what is the learning doing? It's trying to figure out how to serve you the advertisements or the other communications that most increase the probability that you are going to purchase something from Amazon.com. And that becomes a sort of self-reinforcing feedback loop, which, because the purpose of Amazon, its final cause is to make profit, and because the technology has been so hyper developed, so that begins to shape our overall reality. It begins to shape our social reality, how we make decisions, what we do with our money. And so I guess what I want to just end, at least my contributions to this conversation, on the idea that I think that when we talk about machines, I think we have to talk about their final causes, and the final causes are not in the machines. They're in the humans who control or own the machines. And so,
thank you. I think we're making progress. It's not in the machine. Okay. I feel a lot better.
Okay, I've never not believed that.
And that's why I think we ought to be talking about it a little more in depth.
Right. So I think it's very, and I think that when we talk about shelter, our internet technology, the internet's a kind of, it's becoming embedded in the world. Like, it's not a separate thing. It's part of the formal cause of the world. Like, the internet is not going to be something that we log on to. It's just going to be where we live, because all of our things are going to be interconnected and communicating. Like, it's going to be one big. We're building the machine that we're going to live in, and so, all right, we need to have another conversation.
According to whom? According to
John,
whom?
I'm just saying that's what's happening.
Why there's still a lot to talk about.
I don't buy from Amazon. I haven't bought a book from Amazon in over a year. I'm not on Facebook for 2 years. I've weaned myself off of that. So, who is this we? I think it's really tricky, because there are people who are going to split away, and they're going to hear the beat of a different drummer. And young people are not going to necessarily do what all their peers are doing. I had a very good friend. He was in his early 20s, and he loved Frank Sinatra. And I said, why do you like Frank Sinatra? And, I think Frank Sinatra came from my grandparents' generation. I thought he was an incredible bore, but he loved the middle period. He says, oh, you have to listen to the middle period. And I said, Frank Sinatra had a middle period? And I started to listen to, based on his recommendation, and I realized, oh, this is something I didn't know about Frank Sinatra. This is very interesting. But I learned that from someone who's in their early 20s. And he was not necessarily listening to everything that his peer group was listening to. And I think music is we all have different musical tastes. I love Motown, I love soul, I love jazz. And then there's jazz that became mixed with rock and roll. Miles Davis went through that fusion period. So I think there are all kinds of hybrids. And I don't think all that is just chaos. I think we can, look at some of this and start to realize that there's something invisible. There are invisible kind of work going on here in the margins. And I believe that real creative people are paying a lot of attention to those subtle kinds of dynamics that are happening that may not have gone mainstream yet. And I think that's where some of our focus here has been. We look at those philosophers, or we look at those artists, or we try to present our own poetry or our own art to one another, creating safe enough spaces so that we can, explore this stuff that, is not so obvious. So anyway, I hope we just do more of this and do it better. And I really appreciate that, Ed, and Marco, about maybe we can find future cafes where we can focus our attention on some of the language games we're employing, in, I think, very mindless ways, talking about machines that think. I mean, you repeat that long enough, people start to believe it, and then they start becoming their machines. They've anthropomorphized the machines around them. And I think this is a real danger, that people are becoming more and more robotic. I see this every day at Manhattan. It looks like they're becoming so much more like their devices every day. It's really scary. Anyway.
Well, wasn't that the comment that Gershev made, as how we're automatic, we're machine, back in Gershev's day? He was making a point of paying attention of how we become like our machines. At the same time, though, machines are here. And like any technology, we're going to have to learn how to get along with it or how to use it. And I adhere to what your concern is, John. I really do. The thing is I just think of the word we as multi-perspectival. There's many we's. And I try to just accept that I don't hang with all the we's that are we out there.
Well, if I was to chime in my future
Please, Doug, please.
I like the term biosemiotics. I don't know much about it, but there seems to be a well-defined language that could be formed out of that exploration. And eco-semantics sounds pretty cool. So I hope to have a little bit more on that. But I've taken note of the music cafe. I think a lively rendition from various artists in various forms would be very welcome. So thank you for that idea, Mark. Then of course, even though we can define machine learning and this AI stuff in a one sentence summary, like we just did maybe 2 times in this discussion, it obviously needs more discussion. So I would appreciate that from a Bezos vision to a Cosmos vision. But yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation today. I don't know if we framed it a certain way or if how it was placed there on the page made things easier or harder or what you'd like. So there's been no response on that. So I take that as, hey, let's just keep going. So that's all I want to say this week. This by no means is the last word. So say what you need to say.
Well, Suzuki Roshi, Zen teacher, said, how do you control a cow? Give it a big enough corral.
I'll just say, I don't think we're going to run out of any thing to say soon.
Not with you, Mark, man. You stimulate conversation very well.
I just like the idea that we have these open frames, it's great, and we can draw upon our shared history, and that we are, I think, a big chunk for me is creating a shared reality. Can we do that through this technology? That's a big question mark. I don't know that we can, but if we could, it would be better than if we can't. Because I think a shared reality is going to be crucial for our species functioning, and much less our evolution.
That's true, John, but I tell you, I walk through the day and I remember these conversations, and every one of you are voices and pictures in my head. So I'm sharing a reality here.
That's right, and let's do that responsibly.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. 100%.
I want to bring my best to this rather than, my worst.
Yes, John. Yes, John, let's hear voices responsibly. That's a good one. That's a quote, John.
I consider myself a multiple personality. I'm a committee inside,
Yeah.
and it's constantly becoming something different. I'm becoming something different every day. So I sort of move in that direction. We are becoming perpetually something different rather than this fixed identity that I hunker down and try to defend.
I think we're putting the civil in civilization. So
That's good. I like that.
yeah, you like it?
Maintain a
Let's
simple.
not put the cult in
Civil
culture.
civilization. A little Greek mythology for you guys, huh?
All
So
right.
thank you, Doug,
Bye.
for all of your coordinating. I really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thank you, Doug.
You're doing a lot of invisible work, and you're doing it really, really well. So thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for all of your
Thank you.
invisible work. See you next time.
Hey, Marco, give Doug a raise.
All right.
You get an infinite raise.
Yes. No, I really didn't do any work at all. I haven't been participating in the conversation. I've been on the outside. I just put together a page, and hey, it's getting easier each time. So.
Oh, that's good.
I
That's good to
liked the concoction construing that you did on the copy on that page, but I think the conversation was still continuing on the previous page, so that's why it hasn't jumped over. They should maybe be combined or something, because they're unless this is diverging off in some other direction. But I'm not sure that it is. I think it's recursive.
So I'm going to post some songs maybe.
Oh, cool.
That's good.
So that's about the least I could do, I suppose.
All right,
Goodbye,
take care.
everyone.
Take care, Brian. Everybody, take care.